2, Song of Solomon chapter 2. But before we begin our study, if you would, bow with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the time we share together in study. We thank you for the blessing of an approach to your throne of grace and mercy. We ask that the Spirit search our heart and determine the things we cannot express clearly to you and answer our prayers. Help us to be good disciples. Help us to be good servants. Help us to be useful in the kingdom. And this is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so as I mentioned already, we are in chapter 2. We're going to be looking at the start in verse 8 in a moment, going all the way through chapter 3 and verse 5 as we follow a sequence of the various poems that are included and poetic sections of those works as they go through the whole story of the relationship. It goes from courtship to consummation, from consummation to a bit of trouble and discord to reconciliation. And so that's kind of the cycle of the song as it lays itself out. Remember, the Song of Songs, or the song that is about Solomon or to Solomon, is really identified in this way as being the best song of all the songs. It's the best love song you could find, and it contains within it wisdom that we need. There are a couple of approaches that are important in the text. One is to pay attention to the literal side of it first, the relationship between the Shulamite and the Solomon that is drawn for us, the king that is drawn for us in the text, and their relationship. But then, as we pointed out a couple times, that then teaches us about human relationships, and it potentially teaches us about the greater relationships of love in other areas, though not exclusively, because there are some things that are obviously narrow to the human condition in the way the poetry is laid out. And as we began last week, so we will as well this week, we're going to be identifying part of the theme in the text. And remember, last week we looked at how the beginning parts of the song talk about passion, praise, and delight in relationship. Well, tonight we're going to be paying attention to the committedness of the relationship, or commitment. And one of the key phrases we'll want to look for is right here, "My beloved is mine and I am his." And so that level of commitment is both poetically laid out for us, but it's also intent in the way that the wording is given to us, that she definitely has a clear grasp of what she desires in the relationship. Back in 1850 or so, John Boyle O'Reilly penned a short poem entitled "A White Rose." And the reason I think this will help us kind of understand the ancient poetry of the Bible is that it's going to catch on a theme in that human sexuality and desire, both of these things stem from God's design for mankind. They are given by God, and as such should be seen in their natural and godly setting as being good and beautiful gifts. If we remember that, that also helps us understand how God at times deals with aberrant or rebellious behavior when there's sin outside the natural space. Romans chapter 1, chapter 2 use that same theme to talk about change from natural affection to unnatural affection. So when we think about this psalm here, especially this small segment of the song, pay attention to this theme that Boyle O'Reilly brings for us. It goes this way. "The red rose whispers of passion, and the white rose breathes of love. Oh, the red rose is a falcon, and the white rose is a dove. But I send you a cream white rosebud with a flush on its petal tips. For the love that is purest and sweetest has a kiss of desire on its lips." And so the picture that's given by O'Reilly here is one of merging both purity and then the anticipation of consummation or desire in its fullness. And so he's put those two images together, the white rose with the red on top, is the whole progress of the relationship being expressed in that poetry. And Solomon's text here, the one that's attributed to Solomon, essentially does that same thing. Because in the context of a letter, this is right here, in essence, a long speech or soliloquy that you're going to be seeing delivered in two parts, end of chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3. And the first part we'll look at really captures her anticipation or excitement for the sight and sounds of seeing her beloved. She describes him in a picture that's familiar to her as a gazelle or a young stag as it leaps and bounds over the mountains, and he comes to her. And you have that picture of high anticipation and high expectation. His excitement is also seen in the text as he waits outside her house, peering inside, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. That's all seen layered off to us in the text, and we'll see it rise when we read the scriptures. Also understand that it's really neat that in the Song of Songs, the greatest of the songs, I keep using that rendition for a couple of key reasons we'll see over the course of our studies, we get to have a female voice for the wisdom literature. If you think about this, when you read through the Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, the primary voice, even though often wisdom is attributed to either as a concept or a destination as women, we don't get a female voice in those contexts. They're not worded that way, and you probably don't hear them that way. Further, if you're like me and you listen to a lot of audio Bibles, and I try to do that as much as I can so that I have the Bible read to me while I'm reading along with it in my hand, and I like to do that, almost exclusively the Bible readers that you find are male voices. And so we tend to then associate even this text at times with a male voice. But remember that this is one of those dialogue parts where it goes back and forth, and there's a female voice and a male voice. And so you need to make sure that you're kind of thinking that through even as we read through it in the space of a short Bible study like this. Also, look for this. We had our introductory section, and I highlighted a couple of things like pet names and a few other concepts that reappear in the text, and there'll be some of those as well here. But there are three themes, three big ideas that reappear in this small part of the text. Number one big idea is that sense of excitement, anticipation, and delight that's found in a good, healthy relationship. You're excited to hear their voice on the phone. You're excited when they come home from work. You're excited on the way to the date that you've planned. Secondly, by contrast, separation produces frustration and fear. That's part of the theme of this part of the poetry. And for relationships, especially in their early sections, separation does produce anxiety. You wonder what's going on. You wonder what they're thinking, what they're feeling. The gaps in conversation create uneasiness because you're not quite sure how they feel about much of anything. And so that's highlighted here as well. Thirdly, it's important to understand, the text lays this out, that love must develop at its own pace, without coercion. And the full biblical intimacy that God designed in the relationship has to occur at the right time. And that's part of this whole sense of anticipation as well. Because it's the right time, the right place, and the right person. And the text emphasizes that in the way that it lays itself out. So with the text then, pay attention that this is something that we should see kind of not so much as a manual for marriage. Because it's not just about that. Although it can help in the marital relationship. But it's not a marital handbook because it's about a narrow part of that relationship. Furthermore, it's not just poetry with a physical sexuality theme. It's not just poetry of the eros. It's designed to teach us some theological conclusions we'll pay attention to as well. But also in all of that, we should be getting a good understanding and a good picture of what it is that God is trying to build within us and create within us. He's trying to create an understanding and a picture of our relationship that's healthy and fully invested into the kind of relationships that mimic what God built in the garden. This idea of bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, the full totality of that complementary interaction of male and female in a boundless environment. So before we get into our readings then, because we're going to look at these sections of the text in two blocks, verses 8 through 17 and verses 1 through 5. Any questions or things that you noticed in your reading that you would think would be important for us to pay attention to before we read together? All right, I'm going to go ahead and read verses 8 through 13, and then we get someone who's willing to kind of really project their voice for the next chunk. Michael, do you want to read verses 14 through 17? And Les, do you think you could finish verses 1 through 5 for us? Yeah, and because of our circumstances, really project your voice out so we can hear it really well. I'll start. This is Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 8. The voice of my beloved, behold, he comes, leaping over the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Behold, there he stands behind our wall, gazing through the windows, looking through the lattice. My beloved speaks and says to me, arise, my love, my beautiful one, and come away. For behold, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth, and time of singing has come. And the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. The fig tree ripens its figs, and the vines are in blossom. They give forth fragrance. Arise, my love, my beautiful one, and come away.
O my dove, in the cleft of the rock, in the secret place of the steep path, let me see your form, let me hear your voice. For your voice is sweet, and your form is lovely. Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that are running vineyards, while our vineyards are in blossom. My beloved is mine, and I am his. His pastures, his flock among the lilies, until the cool of the day, when the shadows flee away. Turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle, or a young stag on the mountains of Bethel.
Yeah.
On my bed by night, I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I will seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. The watchmen found me as they went about in the city. Have you seen him whom my soul loves? Scarcely had I passed him when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house and into the chamber of her who conceived me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases.
So in those both sections of the text, there's quite a bit that goes on there. We've got a full perspective of the relationship. We've got an open door to their commitments to one another. And then if we start kind of pulling back, there's a couple of things that I think are super important for us to pay attention to. In verses 8 and 9 to begin with, there is this thing I hinted at already, this anticipation of my beloved. And that's the regular nickname, if you will, that the Shulamite gives to her king. She refers to him almost with regularity, that is that sense of how she sees him. And the description that's given there kind of has this energy and immediacy that's not necessarily fully caught in the dryness of the translation. And so the very words that are used in that text that are described as jumping and leaping have this same spring-like anticipation. It is not just the powerful stag perspective. It's like seeing the newborn things of spring, all the new babies that are born, all the pollen that's open, all the plants that are opening up because the seasons have changed. All of that extra exuberance is included in the word forms that are used that are then brought into the English. And there's some background of the text there. And so that image there really is trying to help us capture an idea of anticipation and excitement. The next section of the text that appears for us shows up here in verses 10 through 13. And there is a whole scene being narrated by the Shulamite woman. She is describing that the king is seeing her after this period of time. It's described as being a winter there in verses 10 and going forward, because the winter has passed, the rains have gone, and she is actually again presenting a view that she longs now to see him. And he clearly is excited to see her. Like, that's really evident in the relational dialogue that's being taken place. Further, there is a clause in the text that kind of balances a lot of this out. It appears in verse 15 down a little bit farther, where it says, "Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that spoil the vineyard, for our vineyards are in blossom." And so that's the next few verses down. There's an interplay that takes place between the vineyard picture, which reappears a lot in the Song of Solomon, and now this fox. Picture them, if you will, as kind of the enemies of one another. The vineyard is everything in its proper place. In a literary sense, the fox then is all the things that ruin vineyards. It's very likely that this phrase could be thought of as a popular proverb or a little bit of a wisdom statement, and can represent all the things that would fit into these destroyers of relationships, because the vineyard is the relationship to a degree. And so the fox can be jealousy. The little fox can be enmity, strife, unresolved misunderstandings. It could be also other people. It could be the other women that she was worried about. It could be other men that both of them are worried about. Other men that he's worried about. All of those things would fit into the poetic terminology that's here, that's really designed to help us think and rethink how relationships can grow, blossom, but also then be damaged and harmed. She comes back in the text in verse 16 and says, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." And so you have a reappearance of that basic statement. Further, it's interesting to note, and we see this a lot in the song itself, the style of wisdom that Solomon gives at times differs from the style of his life. Solomon will write, and it's very specifically said this is the wisdom of Solomon at times, from the perspective of a king who knows about shepherding. But is there any biblical evidence that Solomon was a shepherd? That he was out in the fields? When was the last king that we saw that was really shepherdy? David. David was a literal shepherd prior to his appearance in the biblical text, and has that heritage. And the kingship of Israel is associated with shepherding. And the role of a king is a type of shepherd, but not actual shepherding. He's not necessarily out with his flocks in the field. Because where's a king supposed to be? Doing whatever kings do. Doing king stuff. Being out to war, being with the soldiers, doing the leadership roles from the throne. That's king stuff, not shepherd stuff. But what's interesting about the song is that this king in the text is shown as being an actual shepherd. out with his flocks and herds and out with other shepherds. That should help us, again, to maybe deepen our understanding that this is not necessarily about King Solomon, but it's certainly about a king and in the style of Solomon's writing. And so that this is, again, a deeper picture of the text and saying, okay, what's going on here? What are we supposed to learn? What are we supposed to gain and understand? Well, remember, my beloved, this is my beloved, and he's mine, and I am his, is the beginning of that back and forth once again. It's a good point to recognize that here you get to see that once again, their relationship at its core is built on mutual commitment. And so if you want to make an aside, a secondary application before we kind of step back and look at this chunk as a whole portion, is to recognize that that's what quality relationships look like. That's what a quality marital relationship looks like. And that's what the joy of this particular relationship looks like. That they've committed to one another, they're anticipating the benefits of that and blessings of that commitment, and it comes across in an almost obvious literal way. So let's back up and pause for a second. In verses 8 through 17, what did each of you maybe see or recognize that would be of value, questions you have, or literary aspects of the text that you think are important for us to pay attention to? Michael?
More of what I didn't see. And this is more of a comment on my Bible study with each other, and it's so important because I like literal. I can understand literal. When 16 says, my beloved is mine and I'm his, I can get that. When I'm reading 15, I'm actually trying to figure out if we're talking about foxes there. You know, and when they're really a vineyard that they're worried about. And hearing you explain it, that was not just literal as standing for other things that could have been ruining their relationship. To me, that's more of a comment about how good Bible studies are in groups, because I honestly, I wasn't getting that. I was reading that trying to figure that out.
Right, and again, that fits into paying attention to the literal phase of poetry. So a fox in a vineyard, you kind of figure out that fox is going to destroy the vineyard. They're going to tear it up. And so now we know that she's not actually talking about foxes in vineyards. She's talking about the relationship. To be plain, sometimes she talks about the vineyard as being their consummation of their marriage. And the vineyard shifts from their relationship to their physical relationship. And so that fox narrative comes back, and we can pay attention to that too, and how there are aspects that can destroy or diminish that physical aspect of the relationship. And so that's going to appear. That also helps us understand some of the complications that come up within the bigger parts of female-male relations, conflicts, jealousy, strife, sinful disengagements where you have the break of commitments because of spiritual rebellion and fornication and some of the other consequences that are shown in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And one more aspect about this, and I think it's important to pay attention to, Michael pointed out a great thing, that the first layer we see this is always thinking about the basic bones of the language, where this is vineyard, fox, literal fox, what's going on. Next layer is the relationships that they have. But it's really important that these are things they're saying to one another. This is the speech that they're having with each other about these settings. This is a play with two parts to it, the two people in it. And so there are portions of it where they're talking to one another and they're expressing these emotions to them. Pay attention to the text and notice that, yes, there is a very specific and sexual nuance to a lot of the phrases there, but they are all anticipatory until the marriage is consummated. But they're there. And that also helps us understand what God is trying to get us to glean from the text as well. Go ahead.
It seems to me that, as beautiful as the relationship is explained to us, but it seems that they were still working out some problems.
Well, and look, there's in all human relationships, they're not just like, you never arrive. There's like, oh no, we've arrived, and there's no more discord, because there's two people, they're different. Each person in life is different, and their needs change emotionally, their needs change physically, and this text shows a lot of that. And Roy's right, they are kind of working some stuff out, because there is still the questions of, what about the fox in the vineyard? What's the things that haven't been solved? Now, we're seeing this part in the courtship phase. But pay attention that the text will also show us later as we read through it that there will be complications during the marriage where there is disunity and brokenness and misunderstanding. And we can use some more modern metaphors where each of them spends some time in the doghouse from one another, where it's not right and they're separated. And there's textual blame being laid on both sides to a certain degree. And then there is the reunification of the relationship that's consummated by a return to their understanding of their commitment to one another. This part here closes out. This is like verses 8 through 17 again, where Solomon has swiftly come to the mountain home of the Shulamite after a long winter of being apart. He is trying to ramp up the pace of their relationship. He's enticing her. He's trying to persuade her again to come back to the royal city so they can be together. And she's hesitant to come back because she knows, and this is the way it's kind of shortened out, there are foxes that they need to root out. And those are those attitudes, individuals, misunderstandings, apprehensions that they have. That brings us into chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, which Les has already read for us. And it begins, you could think of it as a dream-like state. That's kind of the way to read the whole thing. It's described and headed as the bride's dream. But I want to ask a question. How many of you here have dreams that are really, really clear? Like everything is crystal clear. Yeah, Roy has them. I've had like maybe 5, it feels like, in my life, that where everything was just like spot on. I could tell you what was there, who was there, everything going on. For the most part, it's hazy. Dreams are like through a misty cloud for me. And maybe that's the same way for you. But it's an important way to kind of think about this text as how a dream would be felt and understood by everybody involved. And we represent dreams that way. And so there's a little bit about this section here that should be understood in a personal dream state. She's obviously not left her mountain home, but she's in bed thinking about the one that her soul loves. It's important to understand that now she's moved along in the commitment tree. We've talked about terms in cultural context at different times about what marriage looks like. We've talked about it in the Old Testament a little bit. Sometimes we talk about in Bible classes about the New Testament aspects of marriage. Here is one of those instances where we see in the Scriptures a level of intertwining of people that is described as their inner person. Their souls are being knit together. It is a fulfillment of the relationship pictured all the way back in Genesis. It is a culmination of the relationship understood as part of God's plan. And that soulmate terminology then comes into our conversation. This is the one whom her whole self loves. And it shifted away from his physical form to now at a level of emotional commitment. And we might even perceive this part of the dream as she is pursuing him in her dreams. Because remember, pursuit was already taking place on his half. Now it's turned back and she's pursuing him. So the next phase of this, kind of lays itself out, where she goes to the city, she's looking around. This picture being in downtown Noonan after everything is shut down and when the power goes out. So all the street lamps are out. That's a more likely perspective of what a city would look like that she would be describing, not with all of our extra lighting everywhere. There'd be lamps in the windows here or there, and the people had turned on because the power was out. But you're going through all those narrow city streets, and she's hunting for one. And she's not from there. She doesn't know the city like he knows the city. And so it brings her up to the text here in verse 3, and the watchmen found me as they went about in the city. And her question, her only question, have you seen the one whom my soul loves? It kind of helps us maybe picture better and understand what's going on. And then it's interesting, where does she take the one whom her soul loves? To Mama's house. It's a place of safety. It's where she feels safe. Earlier in the song, it began off helping us understand that she did not feel confident in the city. She was concerned that the daughters of Jerusalem would see her and think less of her, or be trying to entice her beloved. And in order to feel a sense of safety in the text as it's laid out for us, it says, middle of verse 4, I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house, into the chamber of her who conceived me. And so the text is really super obvious in that it's shifted from him being the pursuer to her being the pursuer, even though it's in a dream. It's a state of, this is how she feels, which perhaps might shift the way you understand courtship and relationship in the ancient Near East. Sometimes we have this picture from the way the Bible lays things out that women at times were not given very many choices into how things played out for them, especially in royal households. All right, I'm going to give you this daughter. And it's very male-centric context and male-centric speech. But yet in the inspired Song of Songs, this is a courtship, and both participants have full control over their decision process. You see her earlier in the same section pushing him back. Not now, not right now. And then it shifts, and we know where her desires are. She wants the relationship to go forward, even though in the outward side, she's been delaying it. And so we get to see a window into her heart. Further again, the imagery here is pretty precise to help us picture and recognize that we should be seeing this as emotionally anticipatory. She is anticipating the culmination of her love, but doing so with wisdom that says at the right time, at the right moment. That's why it comes up to verse 5, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by gazelles or the does of the field, you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. And so I think it's a couple of things we can kind of consider about it. Number one is to quickly realize the conflict on the inside. She's acknowledging her desire, but she's also acknowledging that it needs to be given the space to have its fullness. And in a very simple means, it means that she's willing to push off the physical intimacy until the right time. In a practical way, that's going to be after she's married. And so she's anticipating it. But it's also important to understand that in that middle space, in the space between acknowledging her desire and waiting until the marriage, God is helping us understand that that's good too. That the anticipation of marriage is as good as the marriage itself, because both of them come from God. That desire, it's part of God's plan. The culmination of the marriage is part of God's plan. Each of those components is part of God's plan. And I think it also helps us better understand what God is trying to help us, recognize about relationships even more deeply into those components, if you will. Questions or thoughts here on chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, and then the whole narrative as a bigger part. All right, so it's important then now to kind of step into another seat for a second and pay attention to what do we learn about God from this? What kind of knowledge about whom God is, what God is doing, can we derive from poetry like this? And it's kind of difficult, right? Because we have some interpretive space, like, okay, we have to figure out some emotions. Some of this isn't directly on par with plain, bold statements you might find in the law or in the preaching of the prophets. But here's some things to kind of grapple with that are perhaps important for us to have a better perspective of God. Number one, remember that this exists within the boundaries of God's inspired word. Song of Solomon is keyed to us and considered Scripture. Therefore, it's going to fall into the basket of things that is profitable for correction, profitable for instruction, profitable for behavior like God. So one of the first things that I think that you can glean from the text on a theological and knowledge of God level is that God built this relationship between man and woman. And He didn't build it with this gap mindset that is a struggle at times, where He built male and female kids, and then over here, He only built married couples. And there's nothing existing in the space between them. Because what we see here is one of the things that fill that space. Courtship fills part of the space between childhood and married couple, but not the only space. Because the Bible also shows healthy, vibrant believers who aren't married, healthy, vibrant believers who are widows or widowers. And so there's a lot of space between childhood and adulthood that God has a part of as well, including, now for the purposes of this text, courtship. And there are times where sometimes we try to manipulate that. There is a song in one of the great works of the earlier century that is called Tradition, and the primary singer is Tevye, and it's talking about the tradition of his culture. In that same set piece, they also have pieces about courtship and being a matchmaker. And have you ever watched people try to force relationships between people who that person thinks should get together, that they should be a great couple? How does that tend to work out? Not too good at all. In fact, when you try to force a relationship between two individuals who are not really interested in having a relationship or this relationship, it's just like watching a train wreck. You just know that it's going to go badly. This section of the text helps us understand that you may believe on the outside that these two people should just hit it off. But what's mattering is that do they actually enjoy one another's company? And they may have a lot in common, but not actually have this level of desire to be committed to one another. There are facets here in the text that help us teach that. Now, again, that helps us understand that God sees that and knows that and recognizes it and builds those dimensions within us. For next Monday, or next Wednesday night, that is, we're going to be moving forward in the text. And if you'll notice, we will be looking at a couple of things. We're going to spend a little bit of time in our bonus section next Wednesday evening, how boundaries exist as a part of God's order. That little bonus section is going to be talking about boundaries that are premarital, boundaries that are within the marriage in a biblical setting. Things about, behavior, things about the relationship. In a simple sense, you can think about it this way. There's a boundary around sexual activity. Sexual activity that God has designed has every inch of the space in marriage and no inch of the space outside of marriage. And that's a boundary that God has built into his order, much like a lot of other spaces. Further, we're going to be then hopefully introducing part of the next section of the text, which starts in chapter 3, verse 6, and really focuses on the consummation of their marriage and from a poetic standpoint, how that shows everything that is coming to its fullness. And then there is the wedding itself being described, and a little bit of understanding that things in this realm go beyond physical beauty. And that's part of this section here. Before we close for tonight, is there any questions or last thoughts on the text?